Next, a task force of retired U.S. generals present a new report on the 2014 Gaza conflict. They traveled to Israel to assess the conduct of the Israeli military and Hamas during last summer's conflict. The report was commissioned and sponsored by the Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs, or JINSA, the host of this event. It runs an hour.
Yeah, a good crowd. Yeah, we got C-SPAN, we got Fox. Yeah. Yeah, sit over here. I'm sitting there, but what? Yeah. All right, Harris, we should go, right? Hello? Okay. All right, if I get everybody's attention. Hey. All right, sorry, I want you to continue eating. Please don't let my speaking interfere with you having lunch, obviously, if you had any other thoughts. Thank you very much for coming today. My name is Mike Mikowski. I'm the CEO of JINSA, Jewish Institute of National Security Affairs. We're here to have a really special event, and we're glad to have everyone here, as well as members, including members of the press. We thought during last summer, during the Gaza war between Israel and Hamas, that what was going on there in that conflict had lessons for the United States. That was our view in consultation with former U.S. military folks. Now, as many of you know, haven't been to the organization. If you haven't been to an event of ours, JINSA was founded in 1976. It's a pro-U.S. defense organization. We've been doing a lot with the U.S. military and members of the U.S. military, including a lot of retired generals and admirals for many years. So we thought in our consultation with some of the generals, it would be very useful for former senior military folks to do a study of the Gaza conflict last summer, and what are the lessons that we can learn for the United States. So we have 5 very distinguished members of the task force, and we have 2 very distinguished advisors, and I'll introduce them quickly. We have 5 of those people right here today. Chairing the task force is General Chuck Wald, who's on my right. Chuck his last command was former Deputy Commander of the United States European Command. He was also head of the Air Command, the air attack at the beginning of the Afghanistan War. Lieutenant General Bill Caldwell, his last command was former commander of the U.S. Army North. He also, for about 13 months, was our spokesperson, was the U.S. military spokesperson in Iraq. Lieutenant General Richard Natansky, former commander of U.S. Marine Corps Forces Command. He also was an important commander in Fallujah. Major General Rick Devereaux, former Director of Operational Planning, Policy and Strategy for the Air Force. Major General Mike Jones, former Chief of Staff, U.S. Central Command. He also was an important commander in Iraq. Our two advisors were Professor Elliot Cohn, Professor of Strategic Studies here at SAIS, and Lieutenant Colonel Jeffrey Korn, who's on our panel today, Presidential Research Professor of Law, South Texas College of Law at Houston. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to General Wald. The way we're going to do it, each of them are going to speak a few minutes, and then we ask everyone their index cards, as you can see on all the tables. If you have any questions, when we get to the Q&A, which I'll moderate, please write down the questions. People will pick them up, and then we'll ask a select group of questions to the generals. So again, thank you very much, and I think you'll find the discussion. I'll add one more thing till we get to the discussion. We have handed out, many of you have, I guess, on your tables or at the door, initial drafts of the report. You could also find it on our website at jinsa.org. All right, General Wald, please, thank you.
Mike, I hope you can all hear me, but first of all, I'd like to compliment Mike Mikowski and his staff at JINSA for the great job they did of both setting up the trip, coordinating the individuals we saw on the trip, and then working to get this report put together. So great job there. I'd like to tell you all thank you for taking time today. A couple really good friends in the audience. Lieutenant General Dave Deptula, a dear friend of mine. Dave, thanks for being here. Guy Swan, colleague, worked with you before. I'm sure there's others out there, but it's good to have some former colleagues there. So our intent, as Mike mentioned, was to take a look at the 50-day conflict. And by the way, many of you are very familiar with this, but some aren't. In Israeli terms, 50 days is a long war. I mean, everything is compressed and really a lot different from the standpoint of distances, the strategic depth, the time, the tolerance of the international community, which is a big part of this. We'll talk about that a little bit. And so a 50-day war to them is a long time. There are a lot of things we could talk about today, but the major takeaways we thought from this particular conflict that would be beneficial for all of us, but primarily the U.S. military, were, and we've heard much about this before, and it's becoming more and more common knowledge, is that this conflict with the Hamas and the Gaza in more of an urban terrain is going to be probably the more common type of warfare we'll see in the future, hybrid type warfare. We've heard a lot about that, but a lot of people don't know specifically what it is, and we can talk more about that. But hybrid warfare is what we feel will be prevalent in the future. Non-state actors in this case, even though Hamas is technically the government there, the fact that somebody of the sophistication of Hamas can develop low-tech solutions to very high-tech adversaries, in this case the Israelis. And enemies are going to be creative and use any asymmetry they can. And in fact, as an aside, when you don't have law to worry about, you can do a lot of things that are pretty creative. Third, I think the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, their efforts to avoid civilian casualties were ironically beyond the call of, I think, reasonable in a way. They were very, very, very civilian casualty aware. And, you know, and for military people of my type that have been in combat a lot, I think we're respective of the international law of armed conflict. I know we are. The fact that you would go so far overboard that you almost put your own soldiers in jeopardy is an issue that we're going to all contend with. The IO campaign, Information Operation Campaign, you know, we talk a lot about that in the United States. The United States military has had different definitions of the IO campaign for a long time. But our feeling was Hamas really grabbed the narrative in this conflict for a couple reasons. One is, again, and you can argue the point about whether it's moral or not, but you can make up your own story if you have the, in fighter pilot lingo, if you have the chalk, you own the debrief. And they took the advantage of owning the debrief. They developed the narrative. They had no compulsion about making up facts to serve themselves, which shouldn't surprise anybody. And I know it doesn't in here. But the fact that the international community actually started believing this narrative, if you will. Our feeling was the Israeli Defense Force didn't do very good at countering that. And our feeling also is that in the next conflict, whatever that is, and now we're in one, you have to develop your narrative. You have to be quick and nimble. You have to be credible because of the questioning. There's still going to be questioning if you're credible, but you got to develop a pretty strong information operations campaign. We'll talk more about that. And then lastly, we need to develop some of our own new technologies. Hamas developed or built, as you may know, or if you don't know, about 34 pretty sophisticated tunnels from the Gaza into Israel, into the kibbutzes. The issue was they were going to try to use these tunnels to get inside the farming areas of the Israeli citizens, kidnap them, take them back in, and the kidnapping issue is a big deal. These tunnels are very sophisticated. It isn't like a tunnel that you'd imagine. They start from inside the Gaza in a civilian building, so you can't see where it starts. They dig down almost to 40 or so meters under the ground. They're all cement. They're very sophisticated tunneling. It's something that you all would feel comfortable walking through probably. It's lit. It has electricity. It has communications. They're up to 2 miles long, and they can build these things fairly rapidly. And at the end state, they have different branches that go off. So even if you find one exit, that doesn't mean you have all of them. It's very sophisticated. You can't find these things from the air, for example. There are other technologies that we'll talk about we should, I think, have a little bit better handle on. So those are the main findings, and I thought what we do is we'll start out with kind of a overview of the war itself, kind of what the context was, and what we're talking about here from the standpoint of what the war meant. So if we could start with Rick Devereaux.
Yeah, I wanted to elaborate on what General Wald covered in kind of our first area of findings, and that's this notion of hybrid warfare, which is, in our view, based on what we observed looking at the Hamas IDF campaign, is sort of the new face of modern warfare. It's a type of warfare that's fought by non-state actors, sometimes using advanced weapons like Hamas had available to it, rockets, missiles, UAVs, special ops forces, fought in densely populated urban areas. You know, just as a refresher, Gaza is about 1.8 million inhabitants in this area about the size of the District of Columbia, so very close quarters. And it was a conflict, like in any hybrid war, where civilians become the focus of the information campaign, both civilian casualties, civilians as targets, civilians as shields, also part of this hybrid warfare. And so the information campaign becomes a very important component of the conflict. And as we'll talk further about, interpretations of the law of armed conflict and how an adversary can use those against an opponent. So all those factors were sort of in play, and we believe will continue to be in play for our U.S. military as we face these non-state actors in the future. ISIS, for instance, fits some of the parameters of this hybrid warfare that more and more that we'll be embarking on. And if you think about the implications, where in the Gaza campaign, Israeli forces, by virtually any measure, defeated Hamas on the ground, unequivocally. Yet the narrative, in some respects, was a different one, kind of reminding us that the strategic outcome of a campaign in hybrid warfare will not necessarily be directly tied to the results on the battlefield. Good lessons and implications for our military. And certainly the U.S. has faced this kind of these characteristics before in various conflicts that we fought going all the way back to Vietnam. But I think, again, the Gaza campaign brings them all together in a way that may integrate these factors in a way that we're going to see more frequently in the future. And the trend lines are pointing in that direction. Think about urban populations. By 2050, 75% of the population on the planet is projected to be in urban areas. Access to advanced technology, technologies like drones, certainly rockets, and the tunnels that are a sort of a low-tech end that we'll talk more about it. These are more sort of available to adversaries, yet defending against these kinds of capabilities becomes increasingly more expensive and more complicated. And certainly the information sphere. You know, you have to be hiding under a rock to not understand the impact of Twitter, Facebook, social media, and other devices that in many cases our adversaries are using very, very effectively. So as we step back from the conflict, we really saw this sort of notion of hybrid, unrestricted warfare really playing out in the Gaza campaign in ways that we think will have grave implications for our military.
Thank you, Rick. Next, we'll have Professor Korn talk about the law of armed conflict, which is, in this case, from a former military person. I mean, what we learned in our growing up in the military is that the rules of engagement, the law is the law. Follow it, and the morality is an issue. That's how the Western world, I think, thinks of conflict. In this case, it was probably distorted, and I think the professor can talk deeply about that.
Thank you, sir, and thanks to all of the members of the working group. First, I'd like to emphasize the fact that when I was first asked to participate in the role of a legal advisor, I was really excited about the fact that this was going to be a report written by warfighting commanders on the challenges associated with fighting these type of hybrid enemies. And one of those challenges is the function and role of the law in this fight. And I think that's an important point to start out with, that ultimately this is the domain of commanders, not necessarily lawyers. Lawyers contribute by guiding commanders through complex legal questions, but ultimately what we're talking about here is the application of national combat power to achieve a strategic objective. And that's war, and war is the business of warfighters. And this report, I think, does a remarkable job of highlighting how when you confront an enemy who views your compliance with the law or your commitment to comply with the law as a tactical and strategic enabler for its own objectives, that it creates an immense challenge in compliance. A couple of points I want to highlight that are reflected in the report and I think are going to be reflected in many of the comments. The first is that this domain of images related to conflict has in many ways distorted the proper understanding of the law. There's a perception that the law of armed conflict, the historic body of international law that regulates the conduct of hostilities in war, somehow imposes on military commanders an obligation to prevent civilian casualties. In fact, what it imposes on commanders is an obligation to mitigate risk through feasible measures designed for that purpose. And in that regard, I think one of the points that the report highlights, which has been unfortunately lost in the wider discourse, is that process matters. The process of making an effort to comply with the law is an indication of the good faith commitment to the law by the parties to the conflict. And on that score, the outcome seems relatively clear. There is evidence reflected in the report of two sides to a conflict, one side making significant effort, sometimes beyond what's required by the law, to mitigate the risk to civilian populations, and the other side actually trying to increase the risk to the civilian population in order to gain a strategic advantage in the international public domain and a tactical advantage by making it more difficult for their enemy to employ their power to bring about the objective they seek to achieve. So I think the most important legal aspect of the report is that the law has to be properly understood, properly analyzed, and properly explained, or else it will have a distorting effect on the function of military force, which is to bring about the prompt submission of the enemy. War is not supposed to be a fair fight. Nations unleash their military power in order to achieve objectives efficiently and effectively within the framework of the law. Now, the report also indicates the very significant efforts that the members of the Commission were able to observe and assess on the part of the IDF to implement the law in good faith, beginning with training, going through the deliberate targeting process, and even in the time-sensitive attack decisions, making efforts to mitigate the risk to the civilian population. And that leads to another important aspect of this discourse. The question that should be asked when there are civilian casualties in war is not what caused them. What causes civilian casualties in war is combat, and combat in proximity to civilians. And as General Devereaux indicated, the reality is that that's the most likely scenario that U.S. military forces and many other military forces are going to confront in the coming decades, is having to engage in combat with enemies in densely populated areas. The real question is not causation, it's responsibility. If there are civilian casualties, destruction of civilian property, and civilian suffering in generally, if it was unnecessary, who bears responsibility for that unnecessary suffering? And that is going to be dictated by looking at compliance or non-compliance with the law. So on one side, where you have efforts to warn, to evacuate, to select timing of attack and weapons for the use in attack, that mitigate the risk to the civilian population, and you're trying to do this in an environment where the enemy is deliberately locating its most vital assets at the most protected civilian sites, it reveals to you where responsibility should be allocated for the consequence of those attacks. And focusing on responsibility instead of just general causation will have a positive effect on assessing compliance with the law. Because compliance with the law, particularly in the conduct of hostilities, has to be assessed based on what decision makers knew at the time they made their decision. It cannot be effects-based condemnation. But if you think of the media reporting largely related to the conflict in Gaza and other conflicts recently, that tends to be the instinct. Look at the effects of combat and automatically extrapolate back that if there were civilian casualties, the conduct must have been unlawful. That's a distortion. It's an unrealistic standard to demand of military commanders. Military commanders should be expected to do their best under the circumstances to feasibly mitigate risk, but they can't prevent it. So if we focus on what the law really demands, which is good faith efforts to mitigate risk, and we look to the processes that armed forces and commanders use to achieve that objective, it gives us a better touchstone of compliance with what the international community has established is the standard of legitimacy and legality in war. And one final point that's very important that's reflected in the report is the danger associated with being imprecise in understanding the difference between legal obligations and policy constraints. Armed forces will routinely impose policy constraints on the use of force that exceed those required by the law, and the Israelis did this in many occasions, as many of these commanders have done on occasion. But just because it's a policy constraint doesn't mean it's law. And if we confuse those two, what happens is that we create a perception that if you ever deviate from that policy restriction, you're somehow acting illegitimately or illegally. So clearly identifying the difference between rules of engagement, which are policy-based limitations on otherwise lawful authority, and the law itself is a very important step going forward to make sure that armed forces preserve the full scope of their authority. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Just a quick comment, and I guess you're all going to have an opportunity to read the report. I hope you find time to do that. I think you'd find it interesting. But one of the things the Israelis did when they were targeting buildings in the Gaza is they had, and I guess everybody at this table has heard of this before. I was in the military 35 years and did a lot of combat bombing and led a lot of it. I'd never heard of this before, and that was this technique to knock on the roof the Israelis used. And because some of the command and control, the military command and control were in buildings, obviously in the Gaza, that's where they were fighting from. Through intelligence means, the Israelis would find out where that was. Well, if it was in a civilian type building, the concern was, and they had debates over this, long ones, how the heck do we go after it? I mean, unless we send people in, which wasn't going to be in the cards at that time. So they came up with a technique where they would use a small charge that was not very destructive at all and hit a corner of the building where no people were in, wake everybody up, so to speak, euphemistically, call them on the phone, tell them you got 20 minutes to get out, you better leave, and also drop leaflets. Now, they would. Now, my concern about that is then probably the command and control people left too. But, I mean, that is almost to the extreme of watching the law of armed conflict. Just a reminder, I saw some of you have already used these. You've got a pencil and a paper at your table. Put your questions down, and then we'll collect them at the end and go around those. But thanks, Jeff. The information campaign. To all of us here, this whole, except for some, I could see some of our colleagues probably might have been over in Israel at the time. But most of us were back here in the States, reading it in the paper, listening to it on TV, getting our own impressions made. And that's part of the conflict of, as somebody mentioned earlier in the narrative, Hamas thinks they won this thing. And a lot of people in the world think Israel lost this thing. And a lot of people in the world think the Israelis were the aggressors and Hamas was the, the aggressed upon. and they had the narrative. So Mike Jones is going to talk a little bit about how we saw that part of this. Mike?
And thank you all for being here. As Professor Korn said, when you look at the facts, it was clear to us that the IDF had the right kinds of processes and systems in place to conduct operations in accordance with the law of armed conflict. We did not have access to the Hamas military leadership to have the discussion with them, but by looking at their actions, it was very clear to us that Hamas habitually violated the laws of armed conflict, both in several ways. One is by terms of their targeting, where clearly there were rockets being fired and mortars being fired at targets that clearly had no military necessity and were clearly aimed at civilian population centers and so forth. In the second, by virtue of their positioning of everything from their firing positions to their stores and command and control locations and so forth, in places that were also not required by military necessity and therefore violation of the law of armed conflict. So it was ironic that while successful tactically in accomplishing their objectives, and that was for the Israelis getting a ceasefire where you had a reduction in the rocket fire back to the normal state of affairs, I guess, and destruction of the tunnels that were being used to infiltrate into Israel, that they achieved their tactical objectives. But in the strategic information arena, it seemed pretty clear to us that Israel was not successful in countering the Hamas narrative. So that it seemed ironically that in the court of international opinion that Hamas came out on top. And so how was that possible? And I think there were several kind of basic fundamental reasons. The first is what I would call the missions to resources mismatch. And that is the IDF has a pretty good information campaign apparatus. But as we talk to the IDF, their target audiences are their internal military population and the domestic audience of Israel. The responsibility for the international audience resides in the foreign ministry. However, the foreign ministry doesn't have the requisite capability to be able to deal with that audience. So you have very robust capability on one side, but not the responsibility for the international audience. On the other side, you have the responsibility, but without the wherewithal to be able to be effective. The second piece is that clearly Hamas had a fairly sophisticated information campaign to be able to use especially the visuals of the effects of the combat that was occurring in Gaza in order to shape international opinion, and they did a very sophisticated job of using social media, and in fact had different messages depending on the language and the target audiences of the type of social media that they were using. Obviously, Middle Eastern audiences had one series of messages. Western audiences had a different series of messages, again, in order to try to achieve their aims. And it was interesting to me that it was almost as if the IDF was fighting a combat campaign with a supporting information effort, whereas for Hamas, they were fighting an information campaign that was enabled by military operations. So they both looked at it very, very differently. So what does that mean in terms of importance for the United States? Well, I think, first of all, we have also a similar issue in terms of the responsibility of the Department of Defense versus the Department of State in various audience and who's responsible for what, and then who has the capability. And we really, I believe, need to get the responsibilities lined up with the resources and the capability to be able to do the missions. Because we're going to face this same kind of information campaign being worked against us. The second thing is I believe we have to solve the tension that rightfully exists, but it's a tension between the government use of social media in order to get out the truth to the key audiences who need to know. So our truthful information, we have to learn how to use this domain and learn how to be very adept at social media to combat the misinformation that I'm sure that our enemies will continue to use. And then the last thing is to understand that we're not talking about the future. We are in conflict with enemies now, and the information campaign is being waged. So we do not have lots of time to kind of think about this problem. We need to get on with solutions as quickly as possible.
Good job, Mike. That last point about don't wait till the conflict. I mean, it's an ongoing issue from the standpoint of, I guess, influencing the battlefield, if you will, and all of us could do better at that. But lastly, Rich Natonsky, retired 3-star Marine general, fought in Fallujah, led the battle there, is going to talk a little bit about some of the things that probably are more traditional military from the standpoint of technological issues that we need to address and some of the lessons we learned from viewing this 50-day war. Rich?
As General Wald mentioned, tunnels were pretty extensive in the Gaza Strip. We've talked for years about a land, a sea, and an air domain, and recently we've talked about the cyber domain. Well, we saw in the Gaza conflict a subterranean domain where Hamas was actually operating underground, doing command and control, resupply, conducting offensive operations, all from underground in an extensive and sophisticated system. This helped defeat the Israeli overhead surveillance, which essentially negated it. This is a challenge we face on our southern border in the United States. One of our findings was we really will see this in the future because it's a poor man's way to defeat the technologies of a sophisticated military. So we need systems that, one, can detect tunnels that can be as deep as 90 or more feet, and also destroy tunnels. It's not as easy to destroy a tunnel that's reinforced that it may seem. This was one of our findings. Another one was unmanned aerial vehicles or drones. We've seen a lot in the news about the proliferation of drones in the United States. One of the greatest fears during the Super Bowl was for someone to use a drone to attack the people watching the game. Amazon talks about delivering packages with drones. Well, can you imagine putting a bomb on a drone and delivering that? Well, Hamas actually did that. They launched a UAV into Israel that was shot down, but it was shot down with a Patriot missile. Now, from a cost-effective standpoint, not a real good trade-off. I was involved in January with a Marine Corps exercise, a large-scale exercise, and during the exercise, the opposing force used UAVs. And it was very, very difficult for the Marine Force to engage those UAVs. So another finding of the group was how can we develop the technology, inexpensive technology, to engage unmanned aerial vehicles or drones. One thing we saw, the Navy has aboard USS Ponce in the Persian Gulf, a laser. That laser for about $1.50 can shoot. Maybe that's a system that we in the United States need to start thinking about. The Iron Dome, and I think you heard a lot about the Iron Dome in Israel, a very successful system. What it essentially did is provide protection over Israeli population centers from rockets that were fired from the Gaza Strip. Approximately 6,000 rockets were fired. Now, the Iron Dome actually engaged, I think, somewhere in the neighborhood of over 500. These were rockets that, based on detection methods, were going to land in population centers. They did not expend Patriot missiles if the rocket was going to land in the Mediterranean Sea or in a field or in the actual Gaza Strip. Of those rockets, the Patriot missiles that were expended to take down those rockets, they were over 90% successful in knocking it down. Those that Iron Dome and those Patriot missiles, coupled with the civil defense system, really protected the Israeli population to the point that there were 6 civilian casualties during that conflict. However, one of the findings that we came up as a group was the fact that the Patriot system could be overwhelmed. Hezbollah has certainly in the neighborhood of over 100,000 rockets. And if you launch in that type of number, you can overwhelm the Patriot system in place. And of course, the United States uses Patriots as well. So managing expectations as well as developing a system that can address an overwhelming attack by rockets was another finding. And finally, mortars. Mortars have been around forever. They proved quite effective. Hamas would fire from underground and then rapidly cover up. Based on the warning system, and there is counter battery, counter mortar radar that will detect the launch, but it gives you about 15 seconds warning to take shelter. So if you have a mortar round inbound, you got about 15 seconds, if you're lucky, to find shelter. We think, along with the ability to detect the mortars, is there a technology, and it may be Star Wars technology, but to knock a mortar round out while it's in its time of flight, which is very short. But that is another technology I think we in America have to address as we take our lessons learned from the Gaza conflict. So that concludes.
Thank you, Rich. Kind of just a real quick synopsis. Really 4 major areas. Hybrid war has been used a lot. You see it in the newspaper. But there is a truth to the fact that we're in the 21st century. We're facing a different kind of, excuse me, both threat and enemy and type of warfare. And people will adjust. I mean, the enemies adjust to the asymmetries. 2 is the whole issue of the law of armed conflict. And it's interesting to me, again, all of us learn different things as we go places. I mean, we grew up in the United States military with the law of armed conflict, rules of engagement, morality, and warfare is being pounded into our head for good reason. And the Israelis lived with that too. They were actually disadvantaged by a organization taking advantage of it or avoiding the law of armed conflict and getting away with it in international court, or not opinion, not court, sorry, Judge. Information operations is not, we've known this for a long time. We've talked about it in our military career, but again, unbelievably huge issue in this case. And like Mike Jones said, Hamas won the information war on this, in this case. They did, in our estimation, they didn't win the war, but they won the international opinion. And then lastly, as Rich mentioned, this technological issue where any adversary is going to try to figure out asymmetries. And in this case, they're moving pretty rapidly to counter what is obviously a Western technological advantage in almost every area. And we're going to have to be nimble enough to address those. So, Mike?
All right, thanks, General. Just 2 points before I start asking some questions, because I forgot to mention my introduction. Excuse me. One is I forgot to explain the logistics, which is that we brought the team to Israel, where they met Israeli civilian and military officials. They also met UN and also Palestinian officials. Their report is based on those conversations, as well as analysis of primary and secondary research. So, and I want to just say, I forgot to add it on a personal level. As you can see, we thought having, putting together very senior military officers who have been in battle, prepared for battle, would be the best judge of kind of these issues. And they've served our country honorably for many decades, and it was an honor to work with them in my small capacity. So I want to thank them very much for all their service. So thank you. We got a lot of questions. Please pardon me if we don't get through to all of them, but we'll try to get through a few of the key different questions that highlight different points. I wanted to, one of the questions had to do with the IDF and the way they operationally worked with it and the implications for the U.S. The question was, is the IDF was able to achieve unprecedented degree of cooperation and synergy between air, ground, and sea components, and they wanted to know, including real-time targeting. And the question is, what does this success imply for U.S. joint combat operations?
I'm going to just take a quick answer there. And Dave Deptula and I were together in the beginning of Afghanistan. On October 7th, we started bombing the Taliban, and I was the supported commander of that. At that time, I had a 3-star Navy Admiral, Willie Moore, over at Bahrain, who was the head of the naval forces in the area. He had 2 carriers. The Marine component was back in Tampa, but he was part of the team. The JSOC commander was a guy named Del Daly, who had special ops. And the Army commander was a guy named P.T. Mikulchek. The night before we started bombing, they all called me and said, I just want you to know that every force I have is yours. Do whatever you want to with them. Now that doesn't often happen, right? And the reason I bring that up is because of expediency. Everybody there knew that, first of all, we had the same objective. We had been attacked a couple weeks earlier, 9/11. The United States was totally together on this thing. It's probably the last time our country has been in agreement over one issue since before that and after that I can think of. And I think the Israelis, my impression is they, just like every other service, there's conflicts. But when you get down to combat, you're going to work together, the combined forces issue. So I'm not a bit surprised that the Israelis would be very cooperative and work together and understand the fact that every element has a part to play. So I don't know if somebody else wants to comment on that.
Sure. Okay. Another question was, it's probably Professor Korn could address best, but all of them. Could you discuss the involvement of the Israeli equivalent of JAG in the Gaza operation?
Well, for full disclosure, I was not part of the site visit with the generals, although I did just recently return from a trip to Israel where I participated in the first ever conference hosted by the IDF Military Advocate General's Department. The MAG is the IDF version of the JAG. I've studied with IDF MAG officers. I'm very close friends with a number of them. And the IDF, in very similar fashion to the United States military, has made a very significant commitment to ensuring that qualified military legal advisors are integrated into both the training process and what we would call the deliberate targeting process. Right? So in battle, not all of your targeting decisions can go through a deliberation process, particularly when you're engaged in close combat with an enemy. But you can prepare your soldiers, your warriors for those very difficult judgments through the training and development process. You can emphasize your commitment to the law through investigations and, where appropriate, disciplinary measures against subordinates who don't follow the rules. And in the deliberate targeting process, you can make sure that the target decisions are vetted through a command process that includes legal advice. And in my estimation, the IDF is, their efforts to do this mirror those of any what I would call advanced military in the world, United States, United Kingdom, the Dutch, the French, the Germans, etc. This is a common trend, and it's an important trend, but it's also very important to recognize that they also recognize that ultimately commanders have to make very difficult decisions, and they have a certain margin of appreciation. That's not remarkable. That's what the law provides, because the standard that those Israeli lawyers are demanding of their commanders is reasonable judgment under the circumstances. And I think they've done a very fine job in integrating legal advice and law into the target decision-making process.
General Jones, you wanted to...
Well, I think we talked to both a number of their Judge Advocate General folks, as well as talking to a lot of commanders who were engaged in the fight. And it was clear that in the deliberate targeting process, those lawyers were offering very solid and sometimes hard legal advice, and From everything that I could tell, the senior commanders listened to them very closely, and as you would expect, generally, were very sensitive to making sure that they were always on the right side of the law and taking that advice. But the other thing that was apparent to me was the tactical commanders. As you know, because of the tunnel issues and the inability to be able to destroy those and find them from the air and so forth, they had to do a ground incursion. And in those kinds of operations, there's no consultative process when somebody's shooting at you, and ground commanders are having to make split-second decisions on engagements and so forth. But it was clear to me in the discussions we had with those commanders that they were very knowledgeable of the law of armed conflict, and that was in their calculus as they were making these combat decisions. And so it seemed to me very similar to what we tried to do, other modern armies try to do, and that is even when you're in a situation where you can't have the deliberative process, that they had the prior preparation to make sure their commanders were well armed to be able to make lawful decisions.
Okay. I might just add that when we started the invasion of Iraq, at the time there was one lawyer per regiment. As the war went through the years, there was a lawyer in every battalion, and he became the battalion commander's right-hand man, very cognizant of the law of armed conflict in the United States. And make one correction, I mixed up my exercise with the study, but I mentioned Patriots. It was Aero missiles for the Iron Dome, so I wanted to correct that.
Let me just make a comment on both those. First of all, an observation. I had not been in combat with any of these guys before, and I'm not sure if we ever served together. We might have, but none of us really knew each other very well. There's two Air Force, two Army, and one Marine, and Natonski would probably say it's a fair fight. But I will tell you that we had good deliberation, good collegiality, as you'd expect. Everybody's a general officer. But it was amazing how in agreement we were because we'd all been trained the same way. Everybody's got their view from the military perspective. The Army guys, fight a different fight than the Air Force and Marines, etc. But total agreement on the big issues, which is that's what we should have. I mean, it's good stuff.
Yeah, I've been involved in a lot of task forces. I've never been involved in a group that was more engaged than this one. I would say that also. Let me combine three questions in one here. One is, how could Israel have been unprepared or unable to win the information war, given their history and having to deal with their history of many conflicts? How do you explain the fact that we never see collateral damage from the U.S. bombing of ISIS, but Israel constantly has to defend its collateral damage? And is it possible for the United States to use truth as a weapon in its conflicts?
I'll just real quickly, and then I know everybody here has got, this is a big opinion for everybody on this one. I think if ISIS could do what you just asked about, just like Hamas did, I mean, they're in a concentrated area, it's a small area compared to where ISIS is. They tried early on, as we've all read, where the U.S. was killing civilians out there. That didn't work. And from the standpoint of truth, I mean, there are subtle people out there that try to do tricky things, and it isn't military. Military, if you're straight up and tell the truth, you're probably going to be well served. But Mike?
Let me answer those from my perspective in reverse order. Truth, I believe, is a very powerful weapon, the most powerful. But the key enabler for truth is trust. You have to trust the source of the truth, otherwise it's not true. And that's why it is extremely important that whether in combat, prior to combat, whenever, our government, our military has to be truthful and to the appropriate degree transparent in order to establish that trust, not only with our own population, but within the international community. In terms of why don't you see collateral damage with ISIS, a couple of reasons. First of all, you have to be there to see it. In the history of Western journalists with ISIS is not good. So So first of all, I don't think it's there. Second of all, I don't think ISIS has, as part of their information campaign, which I do believe they have one and it has a sophistication to it, their purpose is not to influence the international community or to use the international norms and mechanisms in order to bring about any strategic change. I think their information campaign is actually designed to recruit new folks into their cause. And so therefore it's not in their interest to show the collateral damage and all the fighting that's going on. They want to show a different narrative, and that's why I think you don't see it. And in terms of how could the IDF not win the information war, well, they are truly very capable folks, very capable military, but they, like I said, they have this mismatch of mission versus resources. And another thing I detected, frankly, is that in many of the military leaders, at least, it was almost as if they'd given up on the information domain, feeling having been treated unfairly for so long. It was almost an attitude of why bother? We know that people have written this story before they got the facts and that kind of thing. And that there may be a reason for people to have that attitude. But my conclusion was that's not a good attitude to have. You still have to fight in that domain and manage to overcome and just be smarter some way to work around the advantages that our enemies have in that domain. Obviously, people who don't have to be truthful, who don't have to abide by laws and so forth, have advantages in that domain. But we still have to overcome it.
There's a whole bunch of issues here, but one last point, and that is, for the Western fight against ISIS, there isn't any end game time frame. Remember, we mentioned earlier, Israel, 50 days is a long time for a conflict for Israel, long time. I didn't get a sense of that until we were over there talking to them about it. There's been a lot of criticism about the West for not having more bombing sorties flown. Why don't you fly more bombing sorties? Just get it over with. And without giving away information, the targets that the U.S., the West is going after and against ISIS are really, 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 for sure, not going to have collateral damage. I mean, they are so careful right now, it's almost, part of it may be the fact what happened in Gaza. But the other part is, I don't think there's any timetable to get this over with. My feeling is we're going to be doing ISIS-type things for the rest of our life. But there's a big difference. You know, you don't have people right across. When we're in Israel, we're driving down the road and you can look into Gaza and they've got people that could fire rockets at you. Right over, I mean, that's not the way it is for the West. Nobody in here is over in Syria. There isn't any political pressure to get this thing done.
Following up on that, Chuck, do you think Israeli, or does anyone feel Israeli restraint was constructive or counterproductive, and what is it? And does the U.S. want to be held to the same standard that the Israelis set for themselves?
Rick or Rich, either one haven't said anything here. Once you guys, I think we'd all agree.
Yeah, that's a great question. Whoever asked it, we look closely at that point because we all agreed that the IDF used extraordinary measures to avoid civilian casualties. And the question we kept asking over and over, did they go too far? Because ultimately, if you become overconsumed with the prevention of civilian casualties to the detriment of your campaign, not only will you potentially extend the conflict, which could induce more civilian casualties in the long run, but think about future conflicts. And think about fueling a strategy that your adversary will use against you again and again and again as you increasingly tie your hands to these sort of not legal restraints, but policy restraints that you impose on yourself. We think Hamas played that card very skillfully, and that perhaps the IDF went a bit too far in its restraints, well-meaning and perhaps mindful of this information campaign that we're talking about that they also had to be successful at. So there's a certain tension. This is difficult stuff. It's a challenge that our military will increasingly face, especially as we fight with capabilities like unmanned aerial vehicles that will put our civilians and troops less in harm's way, will inflict more casualties so that this mismatch can be used against us.
Rich?
I think the real danger you see is that in the future, human shields may be a way to prevent the enemy, could be us, from targeting certain targets. Hamas used every protected structure imaginable, whether it was a mosque, a hospital, a UN school. I think one of our, go back to findings, was we really need to educate the public and the media on the law of armed conflict. You do have the right of self-defense, and there are times when you are going to target structures there, and there are going to be civilian casualties. But if you don't target structures because of human shields, and the fact that the enemy is actually using the civilian populace to deter or prevent you from targeting things, it's going to cause you a much greater challenge in the future. And I think that's why it's so important that we do let people, and Professor Korn could talk to this better than I can, but understanding the law of armed conflict and how, in effect, you can attack military targets where there may be some collateral damage as long as it's not excessive. Professor Korn, I might ask you to chime in a little there.
Yeah, thanks, sir. Look, that last point is so essential. The term that the general used was excessive, not disproportionate. We talk about a proportionality rule generally, and there certainly is this general notion of proportionality in war, but the legal test is whether or not the anticipated civilian harm will be excessive in comparison with the legitimate military advantage the commander will gain from conducting that test. That's a deliberately high standard to reach before an attack is prohibited. And I think that a lot of the commentary you hear is in fact a consequence of failing to distinguish cause from responsibility, right? Civilian casualties are almost an inevitable consequence of war, particularly in a densely populated urban environment. So the conflict causes civilian casualties, but the law doesn't prohibit causing civilian casualties. The law actually acknowledges and tolerates the unfortunate necessity of civilian casualties to bring about the submission of your opponent. The real question that has to be asked is responsibility, and the law will get us to the right answer on that question almost every time.
I think there's another kind of issue for us too, and some of you have lived in Israel. I haven't, but like I said, I've been there, and I can have a sense of the small distances. I mean, it's almost unthinkable for a military to not attack people because of the sensitivity about what we're just talking about here that would allow them to kill your own civilians. I mean, think about it. Does anybody in here think the United States of America civilians would say, yeah, don't kill them, but let them kill us? And it's almost diabolical. And that's kind of what Hamas went down this path a little bit of.
Okay. We've actually run out of time. I want to thank all of you for being here. I want to again thank our distinguished task force members. Including General Wald, who chaired it. And we look forward to seeing you at future JINSA events. Thank you very much.